Everywhere Rogie Vachon went in 1978, the conversation followed him. You're going here, you're going there. Rangers, Capitals, Red Wings. He tried to ignore it, told himself it didn't matter, that he could go out and play his game no matter what the papers said. But that's not how it works. Vachon was 32 years old and playing on an expiring contract. A wife, 3 kids. This next deal had to carry him to the end of his career. He wanted Ken Dryden money. Every goal against started whispering questions. Did that one cost me a year? Did that bad game cost me $50,000? The Kings refused to negotiate during the season, so the rumors followed the team everywhere. On Eastern road trips, Rogie would look down at the crown on his chest, then open the newspapers and read that he was leaving Los Angeles. Rangers, Capitals, Red Wings. What nobody realized at the time was that this contract fight was about to explode into one of the strangest free agency battles the NHL has ever seen, one that would cost Detroit its rookie scoring leader and end up in a U.S. federal courtroom. At the end of May, the contract expired, and on June 1st, Vachon became a free agent. He'd been expecting to be back with the Kings by September, but doubts had set in. He was openly taking offers from other clubs. The news reported on it, and Kings owner Jack Kent Cooke couldn't have been happy about that. Vachon was in the media talking numbers. He said he wanted Ken Dryden money. Vachon had made $150,000 a year on his expiring deal. Now he was hoping for maybe 3 times that. His play had warranted it. Before Marcel Dionne had arrived, Vachon was the only bulwark between the Kings and oblivion. He was a 2-time NHL end-of-season All-Star and had played in 3 All-Star games while a member of the Kings. In all 6 of his full seasons with the club, he was top 10 in goaltenders' games played, wins, and shutouts, and was top 10 in save percentage 4 times, same as Dryden. The Rangers reportedly offered $600,000, but for shorter term. Vachon's watchword was security. As spring moved into summer, Vachon became less and less confident he'd return with the Kings. The Kings offered $300,000. 6 or 7 teams were interested. The Kings dragged their feet. Los Angeles area media were already eulogizing his tenure. Fans considered him shopping his services to be a betrayal. Rumors circulated that Vachon had gone to ground, that he was hiding behind his agent. But it wasn't true. He appeared at charity events and even co-hosted a hockey camp for youngsters in the Los Angeles area to help grow the game there. He was teaching kids the fundamentals of the game. But there were no fundamentals to free agency at that point. It was a brand new game, and everybody was winging it. That game had been set up partially by the labor work of Ted Lindsay, the Red Wings' hard-nosed left-winger who helped organize the Players' Labor Union back in the 1950s. He was banished for his efforts. But 20 years had passed, and at the moment, he was the GM in Detroit. And so, he was poised to benefit from the momentum of a ball that he had helped to get rolling in the first place. The Red Wings had become front-runners of the Rogie Vachon sweepstakes, offering the best balance of number and term. While Vachon was being courted, Kings management scrambled, trying to make a deal for a younger goalie to undermine what little leverage he had left. The Kings tried to trade puck-moving defenseman Gary Sargent to Cleveland for Gilles Meloche. That didn't pan out. But they still had several targets, including Chico Resch of the crowded Islanders, one of Bernie Parent and Wayne Stevenson of Philadelphia, Wayne Thomas and John Davidson of the Rangers, or Gilles Gilbert and Ron Graham from Boston. All the speculation and all the waiting was adding up. Vachon found it hard to sleep at night. He hated the thought of leaving Los Angeles, but the Kings weren't close. Most of the other teams in the race had already backed out, scared off by league rules that forced them into arbitration. That would mean losing a star player to the Kings as compensation for signing Vachon. For the Rangers, that could have meant giving up one of the 2 marquee Swedes they'd just signed, Anders Hedberg or Ulf Nilsson. Owner Sonny Werblin had deep pockets, and Vachon had been penciled in as a top priority heading into the offseason. But giving up a newly acquired star before he even wore a Rangers sweater didn't make sense, so New York pulled back. The free agency system froze most of the market. Teams that may have paid $600,000 a year suddenly turned cautious, knowing that a big contract might cost them a young core piece in return. Vachon's earning landscape shrank, from the Rangers' rumored $600,000 per year down to roughly $300,000 from Detroit. Vachon remained focused on providing security for his family. The Kings, meanwhile, went the other direction. With fewer bidders on the board, they dropped their own number from $300,000 to $200,000. The very system that gave him free agency simultaneously limited his earning potential. Kings fans felt abandoned by Rogie. Rogie felt abandoned by Kings management. For the Kings, it wasn't abandonment, it was business. It was announced on August 9th of 1978 that Rogie had signed with Detroit, though financial details were not immediately released. It was later revealed that Rogie would be paid $1.3 million over 5 years, an average annual value of $260,000. Less than half of what he'd been expecting, but nearly double what he'd been making in LA. Lindsay didn't announce the deal right away. He was busy offering half the roster to LA for compensation so that the Kings wouldn't take him to arbitration. Lindsay offered the Kings Jim Rutherford, Jean Hamel, Dennis Polonich, and Bill Lockheed. But quantity doesn't replace quality on an NHL roster. The Kings wanted Dale McCart and Reed Larson or Willie Huber instead. The case went to arbitration. The Red Wings offered Jim Rutherford and Bill Lockheed. The Kings wisely reduced their request to McCourt only. Toronto Judge Ed Houston filed in the Kings' favor. Only a year earlier, McCourt had been the first overall selection in the amateur draft. As a rookie, he led the Red Wings in scoring with 72 points. The Red Wings were not happy to lose him. In fact, Terrible Ted was furious. The fear of losing McCourt, or any of their other young assets, is the reason Detroit delayed signing Vachon for more than a month. Detroit had already been going through a lengthy rebuild and had stocked the cupboard with good talent. They just lacked a goalie. Vachon's annual number went down by more than half in hopes of lowering the arbitration hit. It didn't work. As disappointed as Wings management was over the loss of McCourt, it was nothing compared to the fan reaction. Thanks to McCourt, Wings fans were excited again. Then, thanks to an international judge's decision, they'd lost him after just a single year for a 33-year-old goalie. Now, they stood outside Olympia Stadium demanding answers. Some ranted, others were dumbfounded. They promised a petition drive. It wasn't the first time the Red Wings had lost a bright young talent to Los Angeles for obscure reasons. Marcel Dion had been shipped out only 3 years earlier after contract disputes left him unhappy in the Motor City. Dion became one of the brightest stars in the league. Now, Red Wings fans were helplessly watching it happen again. And this time, the player actually wanted to be there. Shockwaves from the signing reached Los Angeles in a couple different ways. McCourt refused to report. He filed a suit in U.S. District Court through lawyer Brian Smith, naming the Kings, Red Wings, NHL, and NHLPA as defendants. The suit alleged restraint of trade, restraint of employment, 2 counts of breach of contract, and abuse of an arbitration award. McCourt's case was that he had signed a contract with the Red Wings on the understanding that he'd be playing in Detroit. McCourt asked for the arbitration settlement to be canceled or his contract terminated. Judge Robert Damascio sided with McCourt, ruling that compensation requirements for NHL free agent signings represented a restraining of trade. Damascio said that the rule discourages NHL member clubs from seeking to sign free agents, depresses player salaries, and robs them of the opportunity to put their talents on the free agent market. He went on to suggest that compensation can be obtained just as easily through wisely selected draft choices. McCourt reported to Red Wings camp in Kalamazoo, a happy man. He had nothing against LA, but coaching staff and management had treated him very well in Detroit. For the time being, it was the only place he wanted to play. The Kings were left without what they thought was just compensation for losing Vachon. They claimed in court that the loss of their star goalie resulted in a net loss of $300,000 in season ticket sales. With this in mind, observers get a glimpse into why the Kings were playing such hardball during free agent talks. They were in a no-win situation. Either way was going to cost them $300,000. Ultimately, Vachon didn't even see that kind of money. The Kings also had another, even more visceral problem on their hands. For the moment, they didn't have a goalie, but they had a couple solutions in their back pockets. Vladimir Dzurilla was the breakout star of the 1976 Canada Cup tournament. For more on that, see our previous video. He'd given the Canadian club fits, though in a losing effort. Now, the Czechoslovakian authorities had given him permission to leave the Iron Curtain and look for work. Dzurilla was already 35 years old, 2 years older than Vachon, but the Kings offered him a 2-year deal as a stopgap while they searched for or developed a younger replacement. But ultimately, he signed in West Germany. The Kings also kicked the tires on John Davidson, but that went nowhere. The Kings went into training camp without a legitimate number one goalie. The top AHL netminder, Mario Lessard, had been named second-team All-Star at his position in 1978, but the club was impatient, and the solution they chose would turn out to be disastrous. Detroit had swung for the fences, knowing the risks, and won both the goalie they wanted and kept the prospect they coveted. But all the tension and drama had frayed nerves around the club. At a summer meet-and-greet function, while the McCourt situation was still up in the air, a boisterous woman told Vachon she was going to boo him after every goal he let in. Vachon knew he had to win over the fans. He wanted badly to get off to a great start and change minds. Nearly 15,000 came out for opening night, which, as a side note, was the final season opener in the old Olympia Stadium. Vachon wore number 40. Not everyone booed, but the ones who promised they would got their chance. He let in 5 goals on just 14 shots against the Blues. The headline shouted, "Vachon flops in debut." In the article, Wings coach Bobby Crom was quoted saying the Wings played like hell and should have run away with the game, but the difference was goaltending. Vachon was hard on himself. He'd had what he considered a rough training camp, and he was still thinking about it in his next start. Early in the game, Sabres sniper Danny Gare came in on a breakaway. Vachon stopped him. One save, and Vachon finally settled in. That one moment set the tone for the rest of the month as he went 5 games without a loss. But then he wouldn't win another until mid-December. By the end of the year, he won only 10 of his 50 appearances. His numbers cratered. He never really settled in Detroit. The next season, he allowed more than 200 goals and was traded to Boston in the offseason. It's impossible to pinpoint where it all went wrong. But if Rogie Vachon carried any baggage with him east, it was probably this. He cared too much. Sometimes, that's heavier to carry than anything else. Adam Sandler's Happy Gilmore was inspired by his childhood friend Kyle McDonough, a real hockey player who left the sport to chase golf. But hockey already had its own version of that story, one stranger than anything Sandler wrote. Todd Bergen quit the NHL to become a golfer, and because he never played another game, he retired with the highest goals per game average in league history. His sudden departure from the NHL was so shocking that no one could have seen it coming. Unlike most pro hockey players, Todd Bergen didn't play in an organized hockey league until he was 16 years old. 3 years later, by age 19, he stood 6'3" and had developed an accurate shot. The Philadelphia Flyers selected him in the draft. I won't reach for analogies. The odds of someone starting organized hockey at 16 and still being drafted into the NHL are vanishingly small. It is almost certainly unique in the history of the sport. It was also, as it turned out, a difficult fit. 2 years after being drafted, Bergen would score 50 goals in just 35 games as a junior for his hometown Prince Albert Raiders. He finished the year with 96 points in 43 games. The next year, he turned pro and joined the Philadelphia Flyers farm club in Hershey. He played well, scoring 20 goals in 38 games while taking only a single minor penalty, a profile that did not align with how the Flyers were built at the time. The 1985 Flyers were a veteran team built to contend, with balanced scoring and a deep defensive group. The organization was still shaped by its Broad Street Bullies past, even as former players had moved into leadership roles. Bobby Clarke was general manager. Bernie Parent worked as goaltending coach. Bill Barber finished the year behind the bench in Hershey. In January of 1985, Bergen was called up from Hershey. In his NHL debut against Vancouver, he scored twice, breaking the tie twice. The second goal stood up as the winner. In the following game, he took a pass off a face-off and fired an off-balance slap shot, immediately feeling pain in his abdomen. He stayed in the game. The severity of the injury was not recognized at the time, and there was skepticism within the organization about how serious it was. Bergen missed the next 2 months attempting to recover. Rehabilitation brought little improvement, and he was eventually pressed to return to the lineup. When he did, he scored a goal in each of his first 3 games back. Folks who had followed the Flyers for over a decade compared him to former Flyers All-Star Rick McClish for his natural abilities and killer shot. Somehow it didn't endear him to his coach, Iron Mike Keenan. He was labeled as a floater, lacking intensity and avoiding contact. Bergen had a real abdominal tear, the same injury that had sidelined Al Secord for nearly a season. But in Flyers culture, especially under Mike Keenan, injury was treated as attitude. Keenan doubled Bergen's workload, mocked the diagnosis, and kept teammates behind to ensure he finished every drill. Keenan told Bergen to his face that he believed he was either faking the injury or that it was psychosomatic. Bergen hadn't come from an institutional hockey background and wasn't inoculated to the kind of physical, mental, and emotional rigors of pro hockey. Bergen followed orders, but Keenan had lost him. Before long, Bergen was labeled as lackadaisical and described as having an attitude problem. His abdominal injury continued to factor into his play, but it was not treated as serious. After returning to the lineup, Keenan regularly directed sarcastic remarks toward him. Bergen later said the ongoing tension made it difficult for him to sleep. Coaching approaches in the NHL of the mid-1980s were often uncompromising. Under Mike Keenan, that approach was particularly evident in Philadelphia, and it was not confined to the coaching staff alone. Even as a young franchise, Philadelphia already had a history of mishandling injuries, rushing players back, or trading them while they were still hurt. Bergen was valued for his size, but his strengths lay in scoring rather than physical play, a contrast that shaped how he was viewed in Philadelphia. Bergen closed the season with goals in 4 straight games, finishing with 11 and 14. His final regular season game, 2 goals and an assist, marked the end of his NHL career. As a result, he still holds the highest goals per game rate of any player with more than 10 games played, higher than Bossy, Gretzky, or Ovechkin. The Flyers won all 14 games in which he appeared. In the playoffs, Bergen stayed productive. The Flyers made it all the way to the Stanley Cup final that year, where they lost to the Oilers. Bergen led all rookies in playoff scoring with 4 goals, 9 assists, and 13 points in 17 games. Entering the following season, Bergen was widely regarded as a leading candidate for the Calder Trophy. He appeared destined for stardom. That July, Bergen met with Keenan in Toronto to express his concerns. Keenan reiterated his expectations for hard work, dedication, and a strict training program. From the Flyers' perspective, Bergen had said his piece, and the organization believed the issue would simply blow over. When training camp opened, Bergen was a no-show. He had gotten permission from Keenan and Clark to report late to camp while he worked out what he called, quote, some personal problems. Bergen had reached out to Clark, telling him he didn't get along with the coach, and that he felt he didn't really fit in with the Flyers' culture, and quietly hoped for a trade. Clark passed off Bergen's concerns as the whims of a free spirit, and decided to be patient with him. Bergen, meanwhile, continued to experience abdominal issues and did not believe he could endure a physically demanding training camp. By the third week, Bergen had made up his mind. He announced he was going to quit hockey and try to play pro golf. Bergen had already asked for a trade and had decided he would not report to training camp under Keenan while still injured. When no trade followed, he announced that he was leaving hockey to pursue professional golf. The story was widely treated as novelty, framed as a player walking away rather than as leverage, and Bergen became the subject of jokes and criticism. Months later, he got his wish and was traded to the Minnesota North Stars. Bergen reported to camp immediately and re-aggravated the abdominal injury within days, this time on both sides. An MRI revealed scarring and damage far more extensive than anyone in Philadelphia had recognized. Minnesota diagnosed what Philadelphia never did. The North Stars tried 6 months of physical therapy, and when that failed, they turned to surgery. Bergen missed the entire 1985-86 season. When the following season rolled around, Bergen found himself back in the AHL, this time for Minnesota's affiliate, the Springfield Indians. He played 27 games and was still productive, notching 12 goals and 23 points. But Bergen remained embittered by his experience in Philadelphia. Minnesota declined to offer an extension, leaving Bergen a free agent with the option to sign anywhere he wished. He chose golf. Bergen didn't look back, refusing to so much as watch a hockey game for the next 10 years. Ultimately, he got into the fishing business and settled on beautiful Vancouver Island. Bergen's career illustrates how talent, timing, and environment do not always align. He did not have the temperament, support system, or cultural context that might have allowed the situation to resolve differently. When the 1986 season began, the Flyers moved on without him. They finished atop the Wales Conference with a top 5 offense and returned to the Stanley Cup Final the following year, again facing Edmonton. The series went 7 games, ending in another narrow loss. Bergen would not have sustained his scoring pace had he remained. Still, the margin between the Flyers and a championship was small, and his departure left a question the record cannot answer.
Johnny Bower is remembered today as a Hall of Fame goaltender and a legend of the Toronto Maple Leafs. But for most of his career, the National Hockey League didn't seem to want him. By the mid-1950s, Bower had already won championships, shattered records, and built a reputation as the best goaltender outside the NHL. Yet every time he reached the league, he was pushed back out. By the time he was in his mid-30s, it looked as though his NHL opportunities had been exhausted. This is the strange story of how one of hockey's greatest goalies almost never got his chance. After a hard-fought 7-game victory in the Calder Cup Final, including a heartbreaking quadruple overtime loss in Game 6, the Cleveland Barons were champions for the second time in 3 years. Their goalie, Johnny Bower, had built a reputation as a possible NHL talent in the 8 seasons he'd spent there. The Barons said they were willing to match any contract offer given to him by an NHL team, but felt they couldn't hold him back anymore, so they traded him to the New York Rangers. At the time, the Rangers had a reputation of being a goalie graveyard. They were the worst team in the league, winning only 17 games out of 70 in 1953. To make matters worse, Their starting goalie that year was Gump Worsley, who was 4 years Bauer's junior, and whose performance had earned him the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year, despite the poor record in the standings. Worsley had replaced former Hart Trophy winner and future Hall of Famer Chuck Rayner in net after a devastating knee injury prematurely shortened his career. Rayner would also attend training camp that year, but would act as more of a goalie coach than a player competing for a job. The Rangers decided that they would let Bauer and Worsley duel it out in training camp for the starter's job. In those days, NHL teams didn't carry backup goalies on the playing roster. The stakes for the training camp duel were the difference between playing all year in the NHL or being banished across the continent to play for the Rangers' Western League affiliate, the Vancouver Canucks. Worsley was a Hall of Fame talent, but at 5'7" and visibly pudgy, the Rangers didn't believe in him. Bauer got the nod. At age 28, he would be an NHL rookie. Under Rayner's tutelage, Bauer added a new tool to his skill set, the poke check. Rayner would repeatedly drill Bauer on his poke checking technique and coach him on when to decide to use it. Eventually, Bauer would become synonymous with the poke check and would go down as the goalie who made the technique famous. That year, Bauer didn't win the Calder Trophy, but he played every minute for the Rangers and helped the team to a 12-win improvement in the standings. His play was good enough that the Rangers submitted his name for Hart Trophy consideration. More importantly, with a healthy 2.54 goals against average and 5 shutouts on a poor defensive team, Bauer proved he belonged in the NHL. Late that season, Bauer's wife gave birth to their first child. The proud new father spent much of the off-season doting on his newborn son. Consequently, when Bauer returned to training camp in fall 1954, he was slightly out of shape. Worsley, on the other hand, still stung by the demotion, returned focused and in excellent condition. As the preseason progressed, Rangers bench boss Muzz Patrick felt that Worsley was spectacular, a complete goalie. His impression of Bauer, on the other hand, was that he let in too many soft goals, and as the exhibition schedule progressed, Bauer saw less and less crease time. By the end of the preseason, Bauer was assigned to Vancouver. Nobody outside the Rangers organization understood the move. From the outside, it was a puzzling turn of events, but from the inside, it was a shrewd and calculated decision. One rumor that would surface in Blue Line magazine was that Bauer wasn't very well liked in the locker room. His competitive nature and focus made him seem like an unforgiving perfectionist to the defenseman. He would be visibly upset with teammates for defensive gaffes, while forgetting to reward or encourage teammates for making good plays. This dynamic was demonstrated by Bauer not being seen at the usual hangout spots the Rangers team were known to frequent. He subsequently developed a reputation as a loner. Still, the Rangers would be better served by sticking with the goalie who gave them the best chance to win every night, and Bauer seemed to do that more consistently than Worsley had. And winning, ultimately, makes great friendships. So the loner theory didn't seem an adequate explanation. One other theory is that the Rangers never wanted any of their goalies to feel comfortable with their importance to the team so that they could never ask for more money with conviction. Bauer proved to be too good for the Western League, but he patiently waited for a chance to prove himself again. He wouldn't have to wait long. In the 18th game of the season, on November 21st, Worsley suffered a bone chip on his ankle while making a save. Though goalies had always worn pads on their legs, goaltending techniques of the time often exposed the inside of the leg while attempting a kick save. Bauer was recalled to fill in while Worsley recovered. When his shot came, Bauer was ready. With Bauer in net, the Rangers got the better of a home-and-home series against the Boston Bruins, winning once and tying once. Bauer allowed 3 goals total in the 2 games. Patrick heaped praise on his fill-in goalie in the press. Worsley anxiously waited for his body to heal, fearing he might lose his starter's job again. Patrick used the media to fuel the fire, declaring that he would continue to start Bauer as long as he stayed hot. After 4 games in relief, Bauer had only allowed 7 goals, winning 2, losing 1, and tying 1. To that point, the Rangers had only won 6 of 18 games with Worsley in the net. Still, Bauer's leash was shorter than even he might have realized. When Bauer got shelled for a 6-1 loss at the hands of the dynastic Red Wings in the next game, Patrik pulled the plug and handed the net back to Worsley. One bad game, and he was reassigned to Vancouver on December 7th. By the end of the season, Bauer won the Outstanding Goaltending Award for the Western League, leading the circuit with a 2.71 goals against average and 7 shutouts. He would beat out rival Glenn Hall for the honor, but Hall's Edmonton Flyers would get the better of Bauer's Canucks on the way to their President's Cup championship. By the end of the NHL season, the Rangers had once again finished with 17 wins. Patrik was fired, and the Rangers brought in Phil Watson to replace him. Watson seemed to prefer Worsley over Bauer. During training camp, Watson tried to tinker with Bauer's technique, resulting in more goals allowed. When Bauer, frustrated with his authority-instituted lack of success, reverted to his familiar technique, and more success, Watson saw it as a sign of insubordination. Bauer was once again demoted, this time to the Providence Reds of the AHL. The Rangers improved by leaps and bounds in the standings, finishing with 32 wins under Watson and a playoff berth. They would go on to be the first of 10 straight victims of the Montreal Canadiens on their way to 5 straight championships. But Bauer's year in Providence would prove to be one of his happiest and personal best. After ferrying his family back and forth across the continent from New York to Vancouver and back to Providence, the Bauers fell in with the Lamoriello family. The patriarch of the clan, Nicholas, was a Reds season ticket holder. He worked in the food industry, making deliveries. By a chance encounter, he saw Bauer at a restaurant and introduced himself, congratulating Bauer on his tremendous play. The two became friends, and the Lamoriellos would have the Bauers over for dinner often. Bauer always seemed to play better after a meal at the Lamoriellos. 60 years later, Bauer would call Nicholas Lamoriello's son, Louis, to congratulate him on becoming the new general manager of the Maple Leafs. Another thing that made Bauer's time with the Reds a positive experience was the camaraderie. After every game, win or lose, the team would congregate around Bauer in appreciation of another fantastic performance. The Reds won 45 of 64 games that year, and Bauer would win the Les Cunningham Award as league MVP. The Reds would go on to win the Calder Cup, Bauer's 4th overall and 3rd as a starter. By then, it was no longer an opinion, but a known fact in hockey, that Johnny Bauer was the best player not in the NHL. With the Rangers having just enjoyed a resurgent year under a new head coach, there was almost no chance that Bauer could wrestle the starter's job away from Worsley. Worsley's play was receiving raves of its own. Before the season began, Terry Sawchuk left the Boston Bruins for personal reasons, and there were rumors that Bauer would be traded there. The deal never materialized. The Bruins opted for a younger solution in net. At 31 years old, and with his NHL window closing, Bauer quietly accepted another demotion. This time he was happy to return where he and his family had found friendship and acceptance in hockey. That season, Bauer solidified his place as a minor league legend. He broke the long-standing AHL career shutout record with 37, accumulated between his time in Cleveland and Providence, and finished the season 1 game shy of the career record in that category. He might have claimed the record that season had he not been called up for 2 games with the Rangers to fill in for the injured Worsley. Bauer lost both games and was hastily reassigned. But by season's end, the AHL once again recognized Bauer as league MVP. The Reds played a run-and-gun style of offense that often left their goalie out to dry. More often than not, Bauer would bail them out. Thanks to Bauer's steadying presence, the Reds claimed their 2nd straight regular season title, though they fell short in the playoffs when their offense failed them against Rochester. Bauer was just the 2nd AHL player to win back-to-back MVP trophies, and he had been the first goalie to win one altogether. That season, the Rangers finished in 4th place again, and lost to Montreal in 5 games of the first round once more. That summer, the Rangers wanted to move Marcel Paillet, another of the goaltenders down their depth chart, from the Cleveland Barons to another club. However, Cleveland was an independent team and not part of New York's farm system. Paillet's NHL rights belonged to New York, but the Rangers had an agreement with the Barons that the big league club couldn't send Paillet to another team. To get out of the deal, the Rangers offered Bauer, along with his full professional rights. Cleveland leapt at the deal and sent defenseman Ed McQueen and an undisclosed amount of cash over to New York to complete the transaction. Bauer's time with the Rangers was over. He had gotten his professional shot. He'd proven that he belonged among the game's greats. And though he was frustrated that he couldn't maintain ground at the highest level, his new deal ensured that he could retire with the club where his professional journey had started. Still, the thought of chasing NHL glory never left Bauer's mind. He couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he'd ever gotten another real shot. He finished the year in Cleveland with the all-time AHL record for most games played and wins for a goaltender, to go along with his shutout record, which now stood at 45. In the summer of 1958, new Toronto bench boss Punch Imlich, who had a reputation for favoring veteran players, convinced Maple Leafs brass to take Bauer in the interleague draft. For just the second time, and at age 34, Bauer had a legitimate shot at a full-time NHL job. But that's another story, and another career altogether.
The NHL's first annual All-Star Game in 1947 would be unrecognizable to modern fans. The Stanley Cup champion Toronto Maple Leafs faced a team of league all-stars in a game played hard and straight. Scrums, fights, and high-speed collisions, treated no differently than a regular season contest. One of those all-stars was Bill Mosienko, skating alongside Max and Doug Bentley on Chicago's Pony Line. Midway through the game, Toronto defenseman Jimmy Thompson hit Mosienko into the boards. As Mosienko went down, his skate blade caught a rut in the ice. NHL President Clarence Campbell described it as a clean hit. The result was a broken ankle, an injury that sidelined him for months. Mosienko was one of the smallest players in the league. His game was built on puck possession, controlled entries, speed, and skill. He skated low, bent over the puck, a style that made him difficult to hit cleanly and easy to target. 2 years earlier, Rangers defenseman Bill Moe had taken an illegal low dive at Mosienko, tearing ligaments in his knee. Later that same season, Detroit's Don Grosso bumped him into the boards, separating his shoulder. Mosienko didn't miss any time with that injury. He finished the season 6th in league scoring with 48 points in 40 games. In the NHL of the 1940s and 50s, undersize was overpunished. And yet, Mosienko rarely retaliated. In the 1944-45 season, he did not take a single penalty. That year, he finished 5th in league scoring with 54 points in 50 games and was awarded the Lady Byng Trophy. Photographs from Toronto show Mosienko being wheeled into the hospital on a gurney, wearing the same easy grin that followed him through his career. NHL defenses were composed of slow-footed but sturdy skaters in the 1930s and 40s. The style of play on offense was to carry the puck over the blue line. The defense's job was to stop the puck carrier if possible, or to knock him off the puck, steal it away, then move it back up the ice. It was a grinding style that stifled offense. There was a weapon that could break the system, but not everybody had possession of it. That weapon was game-breaking speed. Mosienko entered the league as a teenager during World War II. At 5'8", 160 pounds, his frame made him compact, agile, and speedy. As an enlisted man, his cross-border travels were restricted, delaying his full exposure to the NHL as a youngster. When he finally played a full season, he scored 70 points in 50 games, electrifying the Madhouse crowd with his speed and creativity. By virtue of his God-given talents, Mosienko had broken the system. If left unchecked, he would soon make every slow and stout defender's job expendable. Because lineups had been built along this model all the way down to junior, it would take half a decade or more for developmental leagues to come up with a response. Until then, the NHL's core of sturdy, crushing defensemen would have to come up with a way of neutralizing the offensive threat. They responded with brute force. If an attacker like Mosienko was going to enter the zone at blazing speed, a solid hip check might make him slow up on his next attempt. During his career, Mosienko sustained 4 nose breaks, a fractured jaw, knocked out teeth and various sprains, torn ligaments in both knees, and cuts to the head to go along with a fractured ankle. His biggest problem, though, was his shoulder. It had been separated, fractured, and dislocated, and remained a sore spot for the remainder of his career. He also finished with 121 penalty minutes in 711 career games, all with Chicago. In October 1953, he got into his only career fight. It was against the Red Wings' highly effective checking forward, Marty Pavelich. Mosienko had already decided it was going to be his final season in the league. He had rarely retaliated to the physical abuse he had sustained on a nightly basis for 13 seasons. Pavelich was a tenacious checker, considered the best of his era. The lowly Blackhawks considered the Red Wings their biggest rivals. The Red Wings were in the midst of a dynasty built in part by Red Wings managers treating the Blackhawks like a farm team as the Wings and Hawks fell under the ownership of a single family. Enough was enough. Mosienko finally let one of his tormentors have it. A week after the fight, a Hockey News cover story described Eddie Shore holding court with developmental team managers decrying the state of the sport, pleading to eliminate holding, hooking, and cross-checking from the game. Hockey was getting boring, a niche sport. There was too much clutching and grabbing, not enough speed and excitement. The growth of the game was being stunted by its own tactics. While there were whispers of adding the AHL's Cleveland Barons to the big league circuit, the NHL had stagnated in member size for a dozen years or so, and wouldn't expand for more than a dozen more. And even then, attracting new audiences was slow, uncertain work. By the end of the 1953-54 season, Mosienko had been invited to play in 5 All-Star games, was a 2-time second-team All-Star, sat 12th all-time in points, and 6th on the all-time goals list. He decided to walk away from the game. He had plans of starting his own team back home in Winnipeg, but the Blackhawks convinced him to stay for 1 more year. He played out the year, but he felt that the Hawks had lowballed him on salary and stepped away for good after the 1955 season. The Hawks tried to lure him back again. He said no. Mosienko left the NHL with a busted-up shoulder, a crooked nose, missing teeth, and name recognition. Everybody knew who Mosienko was. Every hockey fan had seen his grinning face, heard of his exploits. Now he was returning home. The city of Winnipeg had gone 25 years without pro hockey. Now they had a star player, a brand new 9,100-seat arena, gold mining seed money, and a growing and ambitious league to back them. The Winnipeg Warriors would begin play in the 1955-56 Western Hockey League season. The WHL had big plans to turn major pro, and ultimately, to force the NHL into an East-West Stanley Cup showdown. Winnipeg would be one of the Western League's crown jewels. Mosienko, its marquee player. Mosienko might have had mixed feelings about the plan. The Warriors played a different brand of hockey, freewheeling and adventurous. All season long and into the playoffs, the club smashed league attendance records. It was a breath of fresh air for Mosienko. He played on the second line, providing speed and depth scoring. In the playoffs that year, however, he scored clutch goals and provided veteran leadership. That veteran presence was not lost on teammates Fred Shiro and first-year pro Mike Nikoluk. They saw firsthand the after-effects of brute force neutralizing speed. After more than a dozen seasons in the NHL, Mosienko resembled a cat that had been in one too many alley fights. He never stopped grinning, though. In his final 10 seasons with the Blackhawks, the team played 11 playoff games. In the Warriors' first season, they won the President's Cup as league champions. Then, they played the Quebec League champs for the Edinburgh Trophy and won that too. During the official presentation ceremony of the Edinburgh Trophy, Mosienko told the 10,000 in attendance that Chicago had never been like this. Mosienko stayed with the Warriors for 3 more seasons. His offensive totals kept going up, while the wins, loss, and attendance records kept trending down. He finally retired for good after the 1959 season at 38 years old. He took over as coach the next year, but that didn't last. A couple years after that, the team folded. Just like that. Mosienko walked away from the game, appearing in the odd old-timers showcase. He could still move out there despite his injuries, but he receded from the game to focus on the bowling alley he ran in Winnipeg. Over time, the NHL-WHL merger never happened. The NHL just got meaner and bigger. For a time, players like Mosienko just couldn't survive in the world's toughest league. Eventually, the holding, hooking, and cross-checking did disappear from the game, at least in wholesale amounts. Many of the WHL cities got NHL franchises of their own, including Winnipeg, twice, and speed and skill began to matter more than brute force. Smaller players found a place in the world's fastest league. But in all the twists and turns the game has taken, Mosienko is still remembered today. Whether hockey fans realize it or not, there's one thing they will always remember about Mosienko: his infectious grin. Bill Mosienko was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1965.
If Hollywood ever went looking for hockey stories, and it probably should, it wouldn't have to look far. Charlie Simmer's career has everything: the dizzying heights, the terrifying lows, the creamy middles, and it all happened in Hollywood's backyard. But the real story isn't the drama. It's how on earth the Kings plucked an unknown player, a farmhand, from the minors and turned him into a reliable, high-level goal scorer. Was it the system? Could just about anybody have played with Marcel Dionne and scored 50 goals? Or had there been more to Charlie Simmer than meets the eye all along? They say you can't teach size, but some coaches can't see past it. Charlie Simmer was drafted by the California Seals 39th overall in the 1974 draft. At 6'3", 210 pounds, he had size, and his junior numbers proved he had skill. What he didn't have was breakout speed, but that was okay. It was his size that was coveted. The Seals never really knew what they had in Charlie Simmer. This was a pattern within the organization. The Seals would yo-yo Simmer up and down from the Salt Lake Golden Eagles to the big club, teasing him with phantom opportunities. He would dress for a game with the Seals, but only get 1 or 2 shifts all night. They wanted him to be a checking forward. Then, they'd send him back down for not scoring. The situation proved discouraging. Simmer wanted to prove he wasn't just a fringe player. All he needed was a real chance. This went on for 3 years, even after the organization had left the Bay Area for Cleveland. It's not a value judgment to say that if the Seals had managed their talent better, they probably would have won more games and drawn more fans. But I digress. By the end of the 1977 season, the financial picture had gotten so bad for the Cleveland Barons that they released all their minor league players from their contracts. This left Simmer a free agent. The Los Angeles Kings took a flyer on Charlie Simmer, signing him to a 1-year deal with an option year.
They were getting a big center who had increased his scoring totals in each of his pro seasons, and they got him for nothing. Simmer immediately jumped into a first-line role with the Kings' farm club, the Springfield Indians, and led the team with 42 goals. There, he played alongside Bob Barry, the most productive left-winger in Kings history at that point. Barry had been dispatched to the minors, ostensibly to learn the coaching ropes. The following season, Barry was named head coach of the LA Kings. For the 5th straight year, Simmer started in the minors. Outwardly, he expressed quiet patience, but inwardly, he battled discouragement and depression, not allowing himself to dwell on his situation. By January of 1979, Simmer was having a decent season in Springfield. But when Barry needed a guy who could slot into the Kings' top line, he recalled Simmer. Having played alongside Simmer all the previous season, Barry was uniquely suited to identify what Simmer could bring to the team. Simmer knew how to use his size for offensive advantage, throwing his weight around to scoop up loose pucks and then make a give-and-go play and crash the net. Simmer's first game back up with the Kings on January 13th is the stuff of legends. Barry put him on the top line with Marcel Dionne and Dave Taylor. Taylor dug pucks out of the corners and fed them to Dionne, who established possession, and Simmer was the net front presence the line had needed all along. The Dionne-Simmer-Taylor line took 12 shots that night and scored 5 goals. Dionne had a legacy night with 4 goals in the 7-3 victory over his former club, the Red Wings. And they did it against Rogie Vachon, the goalie who had abandoned them in the offseason. But that's a different story. The Kings had scored just once in the 3 games before Simmer's arrival. Simmer made an immediate impact. Over his first 9 games, he recorded 10 points while scoring in 9 straight. Marcel Dionne was held off the score sheet just 3 times the rest of the season. And even on those nights, Simmer and Taylor would pick up the slack. At least one of the trio scored in every single game to close out the year. By season's end, Simmer found his stride. In his final 9 games, he posted 10 goals and 10 assists. In time, they would be dubbed the Triple Crown line, and they would go down as one of the most successful in hockey history. Simmer would never face another minor league assignment again. That summer, Simmer signed a new contract with the Kings. At the time, he was happy with the deal. He was happy just to be out of the minors. It showed in his demeanor on and off the ice. He was never one to shy away from contact and was known to crack a smile after taking a good hit. In the locker room and on the bench, he was witty, relaxed, and well-liked. That year, Simmer registered the first of back-to-back 56-goal seasons, the first of which tied for the league lead. Simmer stayed humble and downplayed his accomplishments, joking that he was a garbage collector, banging in loose pucks around the goal mouth. His line mates disagreed. The 3 forwards complemented each other's styles perfectly. Each piece was essential to the line's success. Simmer's goal-mouth rummaging helped Dionne win the Art Ross Trophy as NHL scoring leader in 1980. As quick as things were happening on the ice, they were happening even faster off it. In mid-October 1980, Simmer and roommate Glenn Goldup attended a Doobie Brothers concert with Goldup's playmate girlfriend and her best friend Terry Wells. Terry was also a playmate. Her and Charlie hit it off. By December, he proposed. She said yes. That January, the NHL All-Star Game was held in the Great Western Forum, and Simmer, Dionne, and Taylor played together as a line to thunderous applause. Simmer, tall and handsome, an all-star with his playmate fiancée, who just 3 years earlier was mired in an often depressing, unappreciated existence in the minor leagues, was living a Hollywood fever dream. Then he caught a bad break. On a routine play in Toronto, he tried to turn and caught the tip of his skate blade on a rut in the ice. He crumpled immediately. A hospital visit revealed that he suffered a clean break of the fibula and a fracture of the tibia. His season was over. The Kings thought they could do real damage in the playoffs that year. They had 3 promising young blue liners, some complimentary scoring, an all-star goalie, and of course, the Triple Crown. until they didn't. The Kings bowed out early again, reinforcing management's doubts about the lineup. Terry flew out to Toronto to visit Simmer, and the two got married months ahead of schedule. Doctors gave Simmer a year to return to the lineup. He did it in 8 months. Simmer came back sooner than anyone expected, but not as the same player. The leg had healed, with the help of 9 screws and a metal plate, but the timing and touch were off. He scored 15 goals in 50 games, then 29 the following season. Respectable numbers, but a far cry from the heights he had reached before the injury. By then, management had tinkered with the lineup, impatient with the results. They were a floundering team searching for footing in a crowded entertainment marketplace. What management failed to understand during that stretch was that the Triple Crown line was still something to build around. Simmer hadn't regressed. He was climbing again, once more proving himself to an organization that hesitated to believe in him. In 1983-84, the line was finally reunited full-time. Dave Taylor had been sidelined with a wrist injury for much of the previous season. The results were immediate. Simmer scored 44 goals and added 48 assists, leading the Kings in scoring and earning team MVP honors. That summer, Simmer wanted a new contract. He was still playing under a deal he'd signed before he was proven. He wasn't looking for a windfall, just recognition. He had been underpaid for years, playing through a maze of unsigned or rejected agreements. As the team's most productive winger and reigning MVP, he believed he had earned a modest raise. Ownership disagreed. Jerry Buss was unwilling to renegotiate, and new general manager Rogie Vachon found himself stuck in the middle. With his wife Terry at his side, Simmer chose to wait for the team to show him he was wanted. Eventually, he reported to camp and appeared in 5 of the Kings' first 7 games. The situation, however, was beyond repair. Los Angeles failed to win any of the games Simmer played, and the uncertainty hung over the room. Vachon traded Simmer to the Boston Bruins for a first-round pick. Perhaps the Kings were trying to recoup the losses suffered when they traded their first to Boston in 1979. The Kings selected Dan Gratton. It was an abrupt and unfitting end to one of the great scoring lines in hockey history. In Boston, Simmer continued to produce, scoring 33, 36, and 29 goals in 3 seasons there. Though that sounds like a decline, it's actually an impressive number for a former 50-goal scorer in his early 30s. The average goal total for a former 50-goal scorer in his age 31 season is 28. For age 32, that number declines to 24. By age 33, the average former 50-goal scorer has a 22-goal season. With that in mind, Simmer's numbers don't look like decline. They look like near Hall of Fame level consistency. Simmer's slow-footed net front presence style of play was uniquely suited to resist such a decline. But he was eventually waived and picked up by Pittsburgh, where his NHL career came to a close. He played briefly in Germany and San Diego of the International League. The marriage to Terry didn't last, another reminder that the Hollywood chapter had been all too brief. He finished with 711 points in 712 games and 342 goals. It's tempting to wonder what might have happened if Charlie Simmer had been recognized earlier, if the Seals had understood what they had, if the detours had been fewer. He might have hit milestones that change how careers are measured. Or he might have been misused all over again, never meeting Bob Barry, never landing on Marcel Dion's left wing, never becoming Charlie Simmer at all. Sometimes the long way around is the only way it works.
Jeff Carter returned to the Flyers lineup after a 2-week absence. It didn't matter. The Bruins stymied the Flyers' offense and eliminated them in 4. In the deciding game, Carter was a -4. Playing hurt didn't matter, only results.
That summer, the Flyers shocked the hockey world, trading Carter and team captain Mike Richards in separate deals. Richards went to Los Angeles, Carter to Columbus. They had both been drafted in the first round of 2003. They had played together for Team Canada at the World Juniors twice. They'd won a Calder Trophy together with the Phantoms. They'd led the Flyers to the Stanley Cup Final just a year earlier. But a perception began to coagulate within the organization that these weren't the guys to build around. Rumors circulated. They weren't serious enough about winning. They were partying too much. They clashed with the coach. Their teammates didn't believe in them. Carter didn't say anything after the trade. He was stunned. He was angry. His frustration was with the Flyers and how they'd handled the situation. By moving on from Carter and Richards, the team saved over $100 million in salary. Carter was signed on for 11 more seasons, but his no-trade clause didn't kick in until the following summer. They could have traded him anywhere. The Flyers chose Columbus. At the time, the Columbus Blue Jackets had been in operation for over a decade, but they still had the expansion team smell on them. They struggled to ice a competitive team and establish an identity. Though not seen as a destination city for free agents, the club had managed to attract a number of big names in the past, award winners and future Hall of Famers, but it hadn't added up to a defined identity. For their entire existence, they'd struggled to find a true number one center. Now, they believed they'd found one in Carter. For some fans, Carter's lack of enthusiasm seemed palpable. For his part, Carter came to Columbus with an open mind. But privately, the trade felt personal. Not because of the city, but because of what a trade to the Blue Jackets represented. To Carter, it felt like a banishment. The shock never really wore off during his time there. Some took it for attitude. He was expected to form a dynamic duo with Rick Nash, the franchise cornerstone. It never truly materialized. The results disappointed everyone involved, but the failure wasn't about effort or chemistry. Columbus had miscast him. Carter was better suited to a different role than the one they had in mind in Columbus. In Los Angeles, Mike Richards was also having a disappointing season. After 4 straight years pacing near 70 points with the Flyers, he was trending towards 40. With the Richards trade, the Kings were expected to contend for the division, maybe even the conference. Instead, they found themselves in 10th place, in a dogfight just to keep their heads above water. Worse than that, they had the worst offense in the league, even lower than last place Columbus. Internally, the Kings knew they were better than their record. Daryl Sutter's defense-first approach had already given them the structure of a contender. Most nights, they controlled play. On the nights they didn't, they could lean on Jonathan Quick. They had almost everything in place already. They just needed something to bring it together. One more forward to distribute the weight. 4 days before the trade deadline, the Kings reunited the Flyers' top 2 centers from the year before. But they weren't being asked to carry the offense. They just needed to be respected. Adding Carter gave the Kings 3 credible scoring lines. Opponents could try to smother Anze Kopitar and Mike Richards, but that left Carter's group facing softer matchups. If checkers focused on Carter and Richards, Kopitar's line got daylight. It was the perfect addition. Reuniting Carter and Richards was also a masterstroke. It guaranteed Carter a soft landing in a new room and eliminated the onboarding friction other teams would have faced. Los Angeles paid to get him. Jack Johnson and a first-round pick. Johnson had his critics, but he was their most active puck-moving defenseman. The price was real, but the roles offset. Johnson left, Drew Doughty took the job full-time. In Philadelphia, Carter had been expected to drive offense off the rush using size and speed. In Los Angeles, those tools were available, but the ask was simpler. Facilitate. Be a net front presence, lean on defenders, redirect pucks, and punish second pairs for focusing elsewhere. Carter stepped straight into that role. For Columbus, Johnson became a number one defenseman on arrival and held that spot for most of the decade. Carter joined a team with a .541 winning percentage. After the trade, the Kings closed on a 13-5-3 run, a .690 pace. It wasn't that he arrived and scored at will. His presence did the talking. It took 4 games to get his first goal, and the Kings won 3 of those games anyway. Down the stretch, they were fighting Calgary, Colorado, and Dallas for the final playoff spot. The Kings didn't pull away so much as refused to fall off. They clinched after Game 81 and finished 5 points clear of 9th. None of their competitors made a comparable move at the deadline. Carter finished the regular season with 6 goals and 9 points in 16 games. More importantly, the Kings team offense produced 65 goals in 21 games after his arrival, a 3.09 goals per game pace. Before the trade, they had scored 129 goals in 61 games for a league worst 2.11 per game. Nearly a full goal per game difference with the same system and nearly the same roster. But with one important addition. The Kings' true potency was masked by their 8th seeding. They were a team that was scoring 3.09 goals per game and allowing only 1.91 per game. Those are winning numbers. What followed was one of the most remarkable playoff runs in league history. No team had ever taken a 3-0 series lead in all 4 rounds. The Kings lost only 4 games on the way to their first Stanley Cup. Richards and Carter scored 15 and 13 points respectively during the run, but it wasn't how many, but how that mattered. For Carter, the name of the game was simplicity. The Kings had a role for Carter. They used his speed and his size to its greatest advantage. They had the team system in place and functioning at a high level. They were one piece away from unlocking the offense. Not just any piece, it had to be a credible threat. Put Carter on another deadline contender, and the outcome almost certainly changes. Most clubs would have treated him like a reclamation project, a player who needed space, touches, and reassurance. Los Angeles treated him like an answer to a specific problem. When the Kings traded away Jack Johnson, they traded away a puck mover, but a defenseman known primarily for offense. In other words, he was the one misfit on a wet blanket defense. By acquiring Carter, they got bigger, faster, more dangerous, and acquired a player who was a better fit for the role assigned to him by the coaching staff. One other edge pushed the fit from good to perfect. Assistant coach John Stevens had coached Carter and Richards in Philadelphia and understood exactly how to use both players inside Darryl Sutter's system. No other contender had that advantage, and few would have known how to build around Carter rather than reshape him. In a league that treats players as interchangeable pieces, the Kings succeeded by knowing precisely what he was and what he wasn't. There were 31 trades involving 25 teams in the 2 weeks leading up to the 2012 trade deadline, but only one made a difference. Not every Stanley Cup winner needs a deadline edition, and the ones who do rarely succeed by chasing hope. They win by knowing exactly where a new piece fits before they buy it. If Jeff Carter had scored 0 goals in that postseason, but still forced opponents to respect him, the trade would have been a success. The Kings didn't need a savior. They needed gravity. For Philadelphia, the move marked an organizational pivot. For Columbus, it was the scramble for a place at the table. But for LA, it was confirmation. They had the blueprint. All they needed were the building materials. It's what every team goes shopping for at the trade deadline. Almost none of them finds it. Every hockey fan knows the clip. The fall, the empty net, the stunned pause before Edmonton flies the other way and ties the game. A nothing play that became a lifetime headline, and maybe, depending on how you squint at the standings, a pivot point for an entire decade of NHL history. January 4th, 2007. Dallas at Edmonton. 1-goal game late in the third. The Oilers have pulled their goalie. Patrik Stefan picks up a loose puck just outside the blue line. No pressure, no defender, just open ice and an empty net waiting at the far end. He glides in to finish it, and the puck rolls. It skips, wobbles, catches something in the ice. Stefan reaches, tries to correct, and loses his balance completely. Stick out, knees buckle. He slides past the goal line, watching the puck drift wide. Turnover. Stefan looks up just in time to see Edmonton racing the other way. Ales Hemsky now has a point in the standings on his stick, and he buries it. The building explodes. Dallas wins the game, but Edmonton steals a point. Nobody thinks much about it at the time. Not until years later, when that single point becomes the opening argument in a strange little theory about fate, lotteries, and the birth of a dynasty. Edmonton's stolen point slid into the standings unnoticed. 1 point in January of an 82-game season isn't supposed to mean anything at all. But it helped nudge the Oilers a little higher than they should have finished. Just far enough to bend their draft odds. That spring, the lottery balls bounced Chicago's way. The Blackhawks climbed to number 1. The Oilers slid back. With that pick, Chicago selected Patrick Kane, a franchise winger who would help carry the Hawks to 3 Stanley Cups and drag the NHL center of gravity back to the Midwest. And all of it sat downstream from one wobbling puck in Edmonton. For years, Stefan's miss lived in the corner of YouTube reserved for bloopers. A clip passed around for the slip, the stumble, the wide-open net gone wrong. Harmless, self-contained. One of those oddities hockey fans collect without thinking much about it. Then the crowdsourced detective work began. A fan threads the math on Twitter. Someone else adds the draft order. Another traces Edmonton's point totals week by week. The clip mutates, from punchline to proof of cosmic interference. One missed tap-in becomes a sliding door. Suddenly, the video isn't about Stefan at all. It's about the chemistry set of cause and effect that undergirds every season. It's about the invisible wires that connect January to June, and June to a dynasty. Fans aren't satisfied laughing at the fall anymore. They start running alternate timelines. What if the puck doesn't wobble? What if the Oilers miss that point? What if Edmonton's odds increase just enough to win the lottery? The myth and the miss becomes a portal, and the hockey internet steps through it, arguing in good faith that a moment forgotten by the rink itself may have rewritten a decade. And once a doorway like that opens, it never quite closes again. So the Stefan miss becomes more than a slip. It becomes a first domino. It becomes an origin story. And this is where the domino finally hits the floor. That 1 point, the pointless point, eased Edmonton up in the standings by the slimmest margin, just enough to finish ahead of Chicago in the draft order, just enough to change who got the lottery ping-pong balls. Chicago won the draw and took Patrick Kane. Everything that came after flowed directly from that pick. 3 Stanley Cups, a modern dynasty, Taves and Kane become shorthand for inevitability. Kane on his off wing, carving up springtime. Chicago turns from punchline to powerhouse. Meanwhile, Edmonton drifted. Talent, hope, another lottery pick, then another. And somewhere along the line, Patrik Stefan stops being the face of the miss and becomes the face of the myth. A 455-game career reduced to 5 seconds. Because that's the real twist. A single stumble doesn't just echo forward. Fans carry the echo with them, retelling it, polishing it, turning a weird footnote into folklore. One bad bounce, one stolen point. Chicago gets Kane. Edmonton gets meaninglessness. And so we ask again, what would have happened if Stefan had just scored? We have a cultural belief that order can be extracted from chaos. Hockey fans believe ultimately in a meritocracy. Effort plus execution equals result. From a strategic point of view, the NHL is scripted. If coaches had their way, all games would end in a 1-0 shootout result. But the beauty of the game comes from randomness. Accidents piled on instincts piled on luck. Sometimes, those accidents can do more than add value. Sometimes, they change history. The phone call had been simple. He knew which newsroom to dial. He knew what to say. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. He just stated it plainly. If Ted Lindsay and Gordie Howe played that night in Toronto, they would be shot when they stepped onto the ice. He hung up before there could be questions. It wasn't about violence. Not really. It was about interference, about pressure, about planting a thought where it didn't belong. If even one of them hesitated, if even one of them sat out, then something fragile could be nudged off course. That was all it took. In the spring of 1956, the Detroit Red Wings arrived in Toronto with a problem on their hands. The Stanley Cup semifinals were underway, and Detroit already held a commanding 2-0 lead over the Maple Leafs. Game 3 was scheduled for Saturday night at Maple Leaf Gardens. On paper, it was just another playoff game between two bitter rivals. Off the ice, it became something else entirely. Earlier that day, an anonymous caller contacted reporters at a Toronto newspaper with a threat. If Ted Lindsay and Gordie Howe took the ice that night, they would be shot as soon as they stepped onto it. Similar calls were made to Detroit coach Jimmy Skinner. The threats were dismissed publicly as the work of a crank. Privately, they were taken seriously enough to prompt a quiet tightening of security around Maple Leaf Gardens. Plainclothes officers were stationed in the building. No announcement was made. No delays were introduced. The game went on as scheduled. Lindsay suited up. So did Howe. Lindsay, the Red Wings captain and emotional engine, was already a marked man in Toronto long before the phone calls. He was 30 years old, a perennial playoff agitator, and one of the most despised visiting players Leafs fans could imagine. That night, the crowd let him have it. Early in the game, Lindsay took a pair of penalties, slashing and high-sticking, and Toronto capitalized with 2 goals while he sat in the box. The Gardens crowd roared. Lindsay was jeered relentlessly, portrayed as reckless, undisciplined, and finally slowing down. Late in the game, the temperature rose further. Lindsay became involved in a hard stick duel with Leafs forward Todd Sloan. The two men swung at each other with their sticks. When officials separated them, Lindsay received a double minor for high sticking. Sloan was assessed a major penalty for drawing blood. Detroit trailed late, but the Red Wings pushed. With fewer than 6 minutes remaining in regulation time, Lindsay scored the tying goal, silencing the crowd just enough to register disbelief. The game went to overtime. Toronto had chances. They missed them. At 4:22 of overtime, the puck was shoveled out in front of Leafs net by veteran Bob Goldham. Howe had initiated the play from behind the goal. Lindsay swooped in and ended it. Detroit won 5-4. The Red Wings now led the series 3-0. Afterward, Lindsay admitted the day had affected him more than he had let on. He said he couldn't help thinking about the threats, even if he believed nothing would come of them. What upset him most, he explained, was his mother hearing about it back home in Saskatoon. Howe echoed the sentiment. He said he hoped she had heard the game on the radio, but feared she might have been too ill. He wished he'd scored more than one for her. On the ice, however, Lindsay had already delivered his response. He was the last man to leave the surface after scoring the overtime winner. As he skated slowly toward the exit, he turned back toward the stands. He bowed, mockingly, to the crowd of more than 13,000. Then, with blood still on his face, he raised his hockey stick to his shoulder. He sighted it like a rifle, and he fired imaginary shots into the crowd. Some fans laughed. A few flinched. More than one sports writer later admitted the gesture was convincing enough to make them instinctively duck. For the first time that day, the thought surfaced in the mind of the crank caller, unwanted and persistent. If I hadn't done anything, if I'd have left it alone, maybe this wouldn't have happened at all. Maybe Lindsay would have been just another agitator, another penalty taker, another aging winger grinding through a playoff night. Maybe he wouldn't have been bloodied. Maybe he wouldn't have been sharpened into something colder. The thought lingered longer than he liked. He turned the television off. Detroit went on to win the series. Two-goal tie, Stanley Cup final. 4 minutes left in the third. Next goal wins. Gordy in the box. Doug Harvey with the puck. Marty Pavelich has seen it before. He knows what Harvey's about to do. He's going to fake it going one way, then send a clean tape-to-tape pass to Boom Boom. They've done it to him before. Harvey does his fake. Pavelich makes like he bites on it, but swings around instead, sweeps his stick, and knocks the puck into the neutral zone. He'd read the play perfectly. Harvey was going to Boom Boom. Marty pounces on the loose puck, hustling, a tireless worker. 85 feet to pay dirt. Harvey's 15 feet behind. Marty's missed on a lot of breakaways. 40 feet. Harvey's gassed. 20 feet. Plonk comes out to play the angle. Marty keeps coming, hearing footsteps behind him. Be patient. Plant slides to cover the lower half of the net. Top shelf, glove side. 13,000 spectators lose their minds. Gordy nearly hits the roof. A rain of peanuts and tensely torn up game programs falls on the ice surface. Most fans today don't know his name. Jack Adams, the architect of the Detroit Red Wings, named him among his championship nucleus. Howe, Lindsay, Kelly, and Pavelich. These four were the only ones who played on all four Stanley Cup champion Red Wings teams in the 1950s, and all 7 consecutive first-place finishes. The Wings finished first in the league 8 of his 10 seasons. The Wings only finished first once in the 10 years before his arrival. They only finished first one time between his departure and Steve Yzerman's arrival. Pavelich never had a 20-goal season, never scored 40 points, but the ones he did score always seemed to count. 20 of his 93 goals were game winners. 15 of them were unassisted. 45 were scored with the game tied or with the Wings down by 1. His job wasn't to score goals, but to stop the other guy from scoring goals. As a left wing, his job was to check the other team's top right winger. 10 nights a year, that meant going up against Rocket Richard. The puck drops. Face-off won by Montreal. The puck moves to Richard. Richard charging hard into the Red Wings zone. Draped across him like a shadow is number 11, Marty Pavelich. Richard's got one hand on the stick, one arm fighting off Pavelich. Pavelich steers him into the corner. Loose puck behind the net. Richard's the first one to it. Bang! Pavelich flies in with a clean body check. Stick is up high. Richard is cut around the eye. No call. Richard takes a run at him. The referee's arm goes up. Richard shakes his head in disgust. He steals a look over his shoulder on the way to the box. Takes a number. Later, third penalty of the night is over. Richard comes charging out of the box. Sees number 11 of the Red Wings fighting for a loose puck along the boards. Back is turned. Bobby Goldham, also in red and white, pipes up. Look out! Pavelich ducks just in time for Richard's stick to give his hair a close trim. If it wasn't for Goldham, that stick would have got wrapped around his head. After that, Pavelich said, Richard and I became pretty good friends on the ice. I would always kid him, and he never went after me like that again. Over his career, Richard scored fewer points against the Red Wings and had significantly more penalty minutes than against any other team. He wasn't alone. Chicago Blackhawks ace right wing Bill Mosienko scored 258 goals in his career and had only one fighting major. It came against Pavelich. In 10 years with the Red Wings, Pavelich missed only 24 games and scored 252 points. He wasn't recognized in any official way during his career. He never made an all-star team, but if the Selke Trophy had existed back then, he likely would have owned it. A tireless worker on the ice, he was said to skate with the urgency of a rookie, even deep into his career. Off the ice, he applied the same work ethic. Pavelich and Ted Lindsay had already began building a plastics company supplying Detroit's auto industry. His on-ice contributions were the kind that are usually only noticed by insiders, other players, coaches, and managers. Lindsay got traded for political reasons. Pavelich saw the writing on the wall. He promised to stay in town and continue to run the business while Lindsay was in Chicago. Adams didn't appreciate that. Didn't want a player with his head in his business and not in the game. Adams called him up to his office. He said he'd tried to trade him, but nobody wanted him, so he was sending him down to the minors. Pavelich said no. Politely, but firmly. Adams asked Pavelich if it was about the pay. He said he could promise him a $7,000 base salary down there. Pavelich said he'd retire first. Pavelich understood that Adams didn't want to send him down. He just wanted to hurt Lindsay's business interests. Pavelich had already promised Lindsay that he'd stay behind in Detroit to mind the store. And Adams had tried everything to pry him loose from the city. But he wouldn't budge. He was only 29 years old. He could still play, but Pavelich retired right there on the spot. He chose family stability, he chose to mind his business, and he chose dignity. Perhaps most importantly of all, he was able to leave without his body being broken down. Pavelich never looked back. He stayed in Detroit, the city he had played for and now worked in, and put his full weight behind the plastics business he and Ted Lindsay had started while they were still teammates. What began as a side venture to fill the summers became a full-time operation, supplying parts into the city's auto industry at a moment when Detroit manufacturing was near its peak. Pavelich ran the company with the same steadiness he showed on the ice. Quiet, reliable, never chasing headlines, always where he needed to be. There was no scrambling for a coaching job, no desperate tryout, no minor league comeback. While other players wrestled with the game deciding when they were done, Pavelich settled into work, raised his family, and built something durable beyond hockey. And when the Red Wings finally won another Stanley Cup decades later, ending a long drought, they brought him back to take part in the celebration. For a player who had been overlooked so often in his career, Detroit knowing where to find him and inviting him home might have been the clearest recognition he ever received. There are statues for scorers. Pavelich's legacy is written between the shifts he erased, the games he saved, and the moment he decided he'd rather leave than fall. In January 1959, Detroit Red Wings Norris Trophy winning defenseman Red Kelly suffered a broken ankle. It happened during practice and was never disclosed to the public. Kelly missed the next 3 games and wore a plaster cast on his ankle. Detroit lost all 3 without him and plummeted in the standings. The Red Wings hadn't missed the playoffs in 20 years, and pressure quickly mounted. Wings GM Jack Adams asked Kelly to remove the cast and return to the lineup. Kelly agreed. He removed the cast and played with his leg taped from instep to knee, restricting his movement. Detroit won 3 of the next 4 games. Kelly finished the year in the Red Wings lineup despite the injury. According to a later report, Kelly could stand little pressure on his ankle and could put no power into his skating stride, thus limiting his effectiveness. His production declined, and some began to whisper that 31-year-old Kelly was washed. Forwards beat him to loose pucks consistently. Unable to push off with his injured leg, Kelly was ineffective along the boards and was forced to hook and hold his way out of trouble. For a 3-time Lady Byng Trophy recipient, finishing the season with 17 minors was in itself a sign of decline. Publicly, team brass criticized the club and the media. At one point, Coach Sid Abel fined all the veterans $100 for lack of effort, Kelly included. No one outside the organization knew about the injury. The team kept it quiet out of concern that opponents would target the ankle. Kelly finished the season with a disappointing 21 points in 67 games, a significant drop-off from his usual standard. The Red Wings also missed the playoffs. Kelly was criticized for poor play. Some said he'd lost his stuff. When confronted with questions about his performance, Adams threw him under the bus. During an interview for Maclean's magazine the following season, reporter Trent Frayne asked Red Kelly about the club's recent improved performance. Kelly offered platitudes. Frayne pushed. He told Kelly that reports out of Detroit suggested his legs were gone. Kelly pushed back. He revealed the truth about the injury. Frayne published the account, touching off a small, unintended scandal. When questioned about players being asked to play through injuries, Jack Adams denied the severity of Kelly's ailment, pointing to assessments from team doctors that characterized it as a bone bruise. Red Wings management felt that Kelly's comments about the injury had been framed in a way that reflected poorly on the organization. Kelly, for his part, believed the tone of the article had been shaped to sell magazines. Management's interpretation prevailed. Kelly was summoned to Adams' office. Bruce Norris, the president and owner of the Red Wings, was in the room. Adams told Kelly that he had been traded to the New York Rangers and was expected to report to the team the next day. Kelly told him he'd think about it and left the room. By 1960, the Rangers had earned a reputation as an organization that didn't treat its players well or pay them fairly. Kelly may have heard stories from teammate Gordie Howe about his own experiences attending Rangers camp. The club had shown recent signs of life in the standings, but they were currently entrenched at the bottom, and Red Kelly probably wasn't going to be able to dig them out. The trade was supposed to be Kelly and winger Billy McNeil for Eddie Shack and Bill Gadsby. Kelly stayed up all night and thought about it. The next morning, he called Rangers GM Muzz Patrick and told him he was retiring and that he would not report. There was silence on the other end of the line. Kelly explained to Patrick that he had recently married and was starting a family. His wife was pregnant and she wasn't keen to go. Kelly would go into business, look after his bowling alley in Simcoe. He'd already been on the phone with his other employer, for whom he sold power tools during the off-season to fish around for work. Patrick didn't understand. He told Kelly that the trade had already been made, that he was to report immediately. Kelly apologized and told Patrick it was nothing personal against New York, but he didn't like the way things had been handled from Detroit's end, that he thought he deserved a better fate than to be dumped off to a last-place team.
Later that day, Billy McNeil also called Patrik to tell him he wasn't going to report either. Patrik hung up the phone. Both Kelly and McNeil were suspended by the Red Wings. Adams said they were finished around Detroit. League President Clarence Campbell stepped in to have a personal word with Kelly. He wouldn't be swayed. Campbell had no choice but to void the trade. League Brain Trust lamented the decision. Muzz Patrik prophesied a dark day when players would begin to dictate where they played. Kelly got home the next day to news that Toronto assistant GM Ken Clancy had called. He wanted to know if Kelly was interested in joining the Maple Leafs. The Leafs hadn't won a Stanley Cup in nearly a decade. They had a coach known to be hard on his players. But Toronto was closer to home and wouldn't require Kelly's wife to move. And if it kept him playing hockey a little while longer, then sure. Toronto agreed to send bottom-pairing defenseman Mark Rayom to Detroit. Adams was put in a bad spot. He could let Kelly retire and receive nothing, or accept what Toronto was willing to offer. Adams accepted. Campbell approved the deal. The Brain Trust lamented. Adams was in the press, still smarting, insisting something had to be done to prevent a repeat. Some saw Kelly's move as a loophole. What made it work was that he was genuinely willing to retire. Punch Imlich took Kelly, a declining offensive defenseman, and had him center a line with Frank Pavelich. The move revived Kelly's career, unlocked Big M, and became a major catalyst for 3 straight Stanley Cups from 62 to 64, then one more for good measure in 67. Imlich is often credited with genius for the move, but it's something that Detroit would do occasionally. Imlich just made the Kelly switch from D to center permanent. Kelly was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1969. Imlich was inducted in 1984.
He came in off the street. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't have an agent. He didn't have permission. But he had an attitude and a pitch. Sign me to a contract or Guy Lafleur is going to get beat up. It sounded like a threat. It wasn't. The man was offering protection. His name was Norman Barron, and he didn't have a place in hockey. He hadn't been drafted. He wasn't scouted. He hadn't played an organized game in 4 years, and even then only as a junior B player. What he did have on his resume was a Mr. Montreal bodybuilding championship and a Mr. Quebec title as well. He worked as a nightclub bouncer, and he could bench press 600 pounds. Nobody in Montreal was stronger, and he had the titles to prove it. Watching Guy Lafleur and his Canadiens get ragdolled by the Sabres in the 1983 playoffs sparked something in him. Montreal was the better team, but Buffalo beat them up and swept them in 3. Barron decided during the handshake line, never again. Was it strength and confidence or delusion? So he walked into the Canadiens' offices, built in street clothes. Canadiens' director of scouting, Claude Ruel, dismissed the brash young man with a promise. Lose 25 pounds, come back for training camp, and we'll give you a fair chance. It wasn't a deal, it was a brush-off. But Barron took the challenge seriously. When camp rolled around, he showed up 25 pounds lighter, as promised. He drew stares and dumb looks. Players elbowed each other and nodded in his direction. Who was this guy? Apparently he'd played 7 games with the junior Canadiens way back in 1977. What was he doing there then? He declared to whoever would listen that he was there to take Chris Nyland's job. Nyland was the one Barron blamed for the Habs' playoff loss and for leaving Lafleur unprotected. Against all odds, the club kept him around, signed him to a minor league deal, and sent him to Halifax to play for the Canadiens' affiliate, the Nova Scotia Voyageurs. There, he did his job and did it well. He racked up 275 penalty minutes, enough for third most in the circuit. He even managed 11 goals and 22 points while he was at it. Near the end of the year, he was called up by the big club. Barron played in each of the last 4 games of the season. In the first 2, against the New York teams, Barron was a non-factor. Before the third game, he made some disparaging remarks about Nordiques center Dale Hunter, claiming that he didn't like Hunter's style of play and that he was going to let him know on the ice. Hunter, by then a veteran player with 4 seasons under his belt, goaded Barron into taking an undisciplined cross-checking penalty. He also took an undisciplined spearing major. Nordiques brass used the incident to criticize Montreal's lack of depth and organizational philosophy. He got into his first fight in the last game of the season against Boston's Jim Nill. When the playoffs started, the Habs met Boston again. Barron got into a couple more fights against Brian Curran and Mike Milbury. The Habs won the series, but put Barron on the shelf for the remainder of the playoffs. Barron didn't get a chance to suit up for the Good Friday Massacre game in the next round. One thing was proven in his 7 games with the Habs. While Barron was on the team, Guy Lafleur did not get pushed around. At training camp 1984, Chris Nilan proved himself to be the better player. Nilan had played every playoff game for Montreal the previous spring, whereas Barron was shelved after the Boston series. Barron was assigned to Sherbrooke, where the Canadiens had relocated their affiliate from Halifax. There he was used primarily as an enforcer. Barron balked. After a full year as a pro, Barron felt he had proven that he could do more on the ice than just fight. He thought he had particularly strong chemistry with Serge Boisvert and Randy Buzik, but it's possible he simply had his signals crossed, and the true chemistry was between Boisvert and Buzik. The situation led to disagreements with Sherbrooke coach Pierre Creamer. It was a confident turn for the man who barged into Montreal offices just a year earlier demanding a job as an enforcer. Creamer inserted Claude LaRose on that line, and the trio notched nearly 100 goals, even with Boisvert being called up during the season. Barron scored 5 that year. Creamer sat Barron for about half the season, considering his effort as indifferent. Sherbrooke won the Calder Cup that year, thanks in large part to Patrick Roy, Stéphane Richer, and Brian Skrudland, who would all go on to help Montreal win the Stanley Cup the following season. Barron played 2 games during the playoffs run and racked up 25 minutes in penalties. That September, his services were sold to the St. Louis Blues. It wasn't exactly what he had signed up for, but Guy Lafleur had announced his shocking retirement, and St. Louis represented a chance to get out of the box he found himself in with the Habs. He started the season well in Peoria with 8 points and over 60 penalty minutes in just 17 games. He was recalled by the Blues in early December, but something was wrong. He wasn't fighting. He scored his first career goal in his 7th game with the Blues, but had no penalty minutes on the year to that point. When he finally did get into a fight a month later, it was against a prone and defenseless Tiger Williams. With Tiger on one knee and not ready for a fight, Barron jumped him and pummeled him while he was helpless. In Game 13, it was his first fighting major with the Blues. At times, Blues coach Jacques Demers deployed Barron as nuclear deterrent against opposing teams, but Barron seemed unwilling to engage. By late February, after 23 games with the Blues, Barron had accumulated exactly 2 goals and 2 fights. The Blues had seen enough. According to one source with the team, Barron was sent down because he didn't do his job. That source also added a bitter eulogy. He'll never play for the Blues again. Barron never played another NHL game and retired at the end of the year. He opened a gym in Verdun and eventually settled down as a postal worker before retiring. Barron uniquely demanded a job in the NHL and fought his way into it. But after a while, he discovered he could do more than just fight. He could play. But coaches at the time didn't need another guy who could play. They needed a fighter. But he wasn't going to be told what to do or when and how to do it. He was going to play the game on his terms and show the world what he could do. Today, coaches demand that a fighter can play. The days of the one-job specialist are over. Maybe Barron was ahead of his time. Then again, today, he would never have been allowed in the building to begin with. For 2 magical years, Bernie Parent was the best goalie in the world. 2 Stanley Cups, 2 Conn Smythe trophies, 2 Vezinas, 2 first-team All-Star selections. It's hard to find a better 2-year peak for any position in hockey. For goalies, this might be the summit. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The Flyers' budding dynasty stalled. The winds slowed. The magic cooled from supernatural to merely very good. By 1977, Parent was still an all-star, but the numbers had begun to slip. His save percentage fell below .900, and by the end of the playoffs, he wasn't even the starter anymore. Wayne Stevenson had taken the net. Parent reclaimed the job the following season and delivered one last burst of brilliance. The numbers were still absurd when he played, but the games were becoming fewer. Injuries were starting to creep in, and before long, they would end the career of the greatest goalie the world had ever seen almost overnight. Parent cruised through the 1978-79 season like a yacht on calm waters. He was 33 years old and on the downswing of an already Hall of Fame-worthy career. Slowly increasing skill and parity around the league had begun to overcome the Flyers' once dominant grit and goaltending combo. But Parent was still among the top-tier goalies in the league and was expected to carry the load for the Flyers into the early 80s. Flyers coach Pat Quinn had Parent on a rotation with Stevenson with no immediate plans to change things up. February 17, 1979, Parent's number came up in the rotation. The Flyers faced the Rangers that night. The Rangers were 5 points ahead of them in the standings, and they were both behind the Flames and the Islanders. It was the proverbial 4-point game, and there was much at stake. Philadelphia was staring down the abyss of a last-place finish. But they were at home, where Parent had always been most comfortable. He laced up his skates, strapped on his pads, and put in his contact lenses and got to work, just like any other game day. 5 minutes into the game, Bill Barber put the Flyers up 1-0. All season long, the Flyers had been forced to rally late against the Rangers. It looked like this game might turn out different for Philly. 13 minutes in, Rangers rookie Don Maloney stepped in front of Parent for a screen. Only a rookie would try to get away with something like that in Philly. So Jimmy Watson steps in and plays cop. But those Philadelphia defenders play rough, and he hauls Maloney to the ice. On the way down, the butt end of Watson's stick ends up getting caught in the eye hole of Parent's mask. Parent knew it was bad right away. He got up, tossed his mask aside, and skated towards the bench, feeling around his right eye like it might have fallen out. Watson got called for holding on the play. Parent was taken to the hospital. Initial reports from the Flyers suggested Parent would be out at least a week, maybe 2. For the moment, he was blind in that eye. He had suffered conjunctival abrasions with 2 cuts on the whites of his right eye. Doctors said the damage may have been made worse by the fact that he wore contact lenses. Bleeding in the internal chamber of the eye was also detected. By the end of the week, the news turned grim. Rumors began to surface that the injury might be career-threatening. At that point, he still couldn't see. All told, he had suffered 7 distinct injuries to the eye, 5 of which healed, but 2 were chronic. A constant buildup of pressure and dislocation of the lens caused problems with focus and depth perception. Recovery was a long, arduous process. Bernie would sit in a chair in the hospital. The doctor would toss a tennis ball to him and he couldn't catch it. How could he be expected to catch a slap shot? Ultimately, the doctors pulled the plug. At the end of May of that year, the Flyers called a press conference at the Spectrum. Bernie, wearing dark glasses and looking despondent and unshaven, was still in shock as he sat there, cameras flashing. On the advice of 3 expert ophthalmologists, Bernie announced his retirement. Hockey careers usually wind down slowly. Perron had already cemented his place as a legend of the game. The next few years were mapped out in front of him. He would mentor the next wave of Flyers goalies while continuing to provide a steadying presence and leadership to a team in transition. But Perron's career stopped cold. When he missed training camp, that's when it hit him. On opening night of the next season, the Flyers retired Perron's jersey. He should have been starting that game. He was depressed. He was a young man in the prime of his life, and his career had been wrenched from him. For a while, he turned to alcohol, just long enough to recognize what a problem it was, and what a crutch. Perron wasn't the first post-career athlete to find himself feeling rudderless, and he wouldn't be the last. After successfully enlisting the aid of Alcoholics Anonymous, he found his compass. In the summer of 1982, the Flyers announced that they were bringing in Bernie to be the goalie coach. Interestingly, he was replacing Jacques Plante, who had mentored Bernie during their time together in Toronto. A decade earlier than that, in Montreal, Bernie would stare out the front window in fascination as the famous Plante would bound up the front steps of his neighbor's house to visit his sister. Now, Bernie was going to impart everything he had learned to the next generation of Flyers goalies. During his time as goalie coach, Pelle Lindbergh, Bob Froese, and Ron Hextall all won Vezina or Jennings trophies. He left the post in 1990 to focus on business pursuits. But Bernie never left the Flyers. One of the great thrills for Flyers fans attending home games was the chance to meet Bernie Perron. He'd always be there, greeting fans on the concourse, the team's goodwill ambassador. In 2011, Bernie suited up for the Flyers one last time in the alumni game before that year's Winter Classic. It came against the Rangers. The alumni game featured many Flyers and Rangers legends, but the biggest cheer came when the public address announcer introduced Perron. He smiled warmly as he skated toward his goal crease, waving to the crowd as 45,000 fans cheered and chanted his name. It was The Penguins were grounded. After 2 years of existence, the fledgling Pittsburgh Penguins offered home fans little in the way of attraction. They were workmanlike, the roster practically anonymous, interchangeable, and they did not draw. At this time, the face of the franchise was bookish 33-year-old goaltender Les Binkley. What they needed was a center, a puck possessor. Not flash, but stability. They needed an identity. No one could have known at the time that hope would arrive in the form of a third-round pick, an undersized center that almost every team had passed on in the draft twice over. His name was Michel Briere. It wasn't that he couldn't score. 2 years earlier, he put up 159 points for the Shawinigan Bruins Quebec Junior Club. He followed that up with 161 in his draft year. But, at 5'10" and a sprightly 165 pounds, he was considered too small by scouts. They doubted whether his numbers meant anything. Few bothered traveling to Shawinigan to find out. In an era that distrusted small, skilled centers, Michel Briere fit the profile of a player easily overlooked. Pittsburgh took a flyer anyway. When Penn's GM Jack Riley offered a contract, Briere asked for more money. When Riley asked why he thought he deserved it, Briere reasoned that it was because he planned to play in Pittsburgh for the next 20 years. The Penguins invited 15 centers to training camp that summer, but Briere stood out. To a Penguins group inured to generic play, Briere looked different. He generated a quiet buzz around the igloo, the kind only players inside the room can really feel. Center ice had been a problem for Pittsburgh from the start. Their depth chart was built around veterans and bottom six placeholders. Useful players, like Wally Boyer and Billy Harris, but no one who could move the needle. No one who could settle a line or tilt a shift. Penn's coach, Red Kelly, normally restrained in his public comments, broke character. He praised the rookie openly. In that era, almost no one jumped straight from junior to the NHL. But with Pittsburgh's center depth what it was, and with Briere's mix of speed, patience, and smarts, he bucked the trend. When he made the final roster, Kelly planned to send Billy Harris to the AHL. Harris chose to retire instead. That left Briere, 19 years old, as the center Pittsburgh didn't know it had been waiting for. Within the first month of the season, Briere was sharing spot duty on the top line with veteran center Wally Boyer. Coach Kelly trusted him with the heavy responsibility of leading the Pens charge because he seemed mature for his age. On the top line, he helped veteran winger Dean Prentice score his 300th career goal. After the game, in which Briere also scored his first, Prentice and Kelly each forecasted 300 or more for the teenager whose career was just getting started. His on-ice mannerisms, his puck handling, his poise, his patience, spoke of a young man comfortable where he found himself. He displayed soft hands, making him equally adept as both a playmaker and as a sniper, though he would often look for the pass first. He would never be mistaken for Bobby Hull, but in a small sample size, proved himself a quietly efficient facilitator. Within a couple of months, he was being called the darling of the franchise, and those few that watched the team closely knew they had a building block. The results, however, remained elusive. It took the team 31 games to get their 10th win of the season, but as bad as they were at times, they still fared better than they'd been expected to. The season before, it had taken the team 42 tries to hit the 10-win mark. Briere got occasionally hot during the year, but struggled to find his consistency until late in the campaign. Still, his skating and poise remained positive signs for the future. He would get pushed into corners but never outmuscled. At times, he was considered a leading candidate for Calder Trophy. More importantly, curiosity seekers and stragglers began buying tickets, slowly at first. A good-sized crowd for a Penguins game around this time was about 6,000, though that would change before season's end. Here a little and there a little, all signs pointed to a dawning renaissance in Steeltown. As the season came winding down, Briere began to establish himself with 20 points in his final 24 games. The Pens also fought their way to a 9-11-4 record during that same stretch. The Pens finished the year with 26 wins and a .421 winning percentage. Briere finished with 44 points on an anemic offense that had gotten shut out a whopping 14 times to end up third in club scoring. Still, their record was good enough to secure second place in the NHL's expansion club's only West Division and an invite to their first playoff action. The playoffs opened at the Igloo in front of just 8,051 fans. Their opponents were the Oakland Seals, a team that, on paper, should have been the class of the 1967 expansion, but never found its footing. Ownership instability, front office turnover, and an indifferent market had drained most of the promise out of the roster. They still finished only 6 points behind Pittsburgh, and the matchup was, in effect, a meeting between the league's two lowliest teams. Game 1 reflected it. Nerves, scrambles, and a disputed go-ahead goal in the third period. After Pittsburgh took the lead, Oakland's Carol Vadnais clipped Briere over the head with his stick, prompting Brian Watson to intervene. No penalty was called. It was a reminder of what playoff hockey looked like in 1970. Hard, chaotic, and often left to the players to sort out. From there, the series settled into a slashing, testy affair. However, the Penguins got the better of it. Any fears the scouts had had in the summer about Briere's ability to hang in there in the tough going of the playoffs were dispelled with one signature play. It came at the end of the series. The series had shifted to Oakland, and with the Penguins tentatively nursing a 3-0 lead, the team played flat and cautious in Game 4. They needed a spark, someone to step up and make a play. Gary Smith, the Seals goaler, had played great all series. With the score tied and his team facing elimination in sudden death overtime, he made what was arguably his best save of the series. However, he kicked his leg out to make the spectacular save and sent the rebound to Briere, who waited at the side of the net. When he found the puck on his stick, he planned a wraparound, but noticed a space between Smith's legs during his flyby, slid the puck along the ice from an awkward angle, and scored the series-clinching goal. As incredible as it seems, that Penguins team was the first in league history to win each of its first 4 playoff games. The Oakland Seals franchise would never again play another playoff game. This was a big moment, one not to be taken for granted. Though the team had a 3-0 stranglehold, that alone was no guarantee of victory. The Penguins and their fans would find that out in a very hard way just 5 years later. It was a modest series in the eyes of the league, but a meaningful one in Pittsburgh. They needed someone who didn't panic in a strange building, someone who could finish a broken play in overtime. In that moment, at 19 years old, Michel Briere gave them exactly that. Hope had arrived. In the Stanley Cup semifinal against the St. Louis Blues, Briere came alive, brawling and scoring 4 goals and 6 points in 6 games. He proved himself to be a versatile player, manning the point on the power play and driving play, no longer just a facilitator. As with his overtime series winner, Briere showed an opportunistic flair, an ability to ooze into the soft areas on the ice undetected, ready for rebounds and backdoor plays. In one memorable moment, which showcased his on-ice poise and vision, Briere stole the puck from a St. Louis defender and set up shop behind the Blues net. He held the puck for 10 seconds while Blues defenders stood by and puck-watched. Then, he calmly flipped a saucer pass onto the stick of Jean Pronovost, who ripped one past Blues tender Jacques Plante. Crowds flocked to watch Briere's inspired play. Game 3 set an attendance record at the Igloo, with over 12,900 fans in the building. They were there to see playoff hockey. Briere gave them hope that the home team would win. Briere scored tie-breaking, game-winning goals in back-to-back games in front of the Penguins faithful, electrifying fans with end-to-end rushes. Blues coach Scotty Bowman sent out his biggest, meanest defenders, Noel Picard and Bob Plager, against the smallish Briere. Briere beat them with superior puck handling and speed, and fooled goalies with head fakes. For a Penguins team that had been the very personification of lunch pail hockey, Briere was a revelation. In the deciding game, Briere scored another tie-breaking goal late in the third period, but it didn't hold up. Ultimately, the Blues won the series, but it was something for the Pens to build on. When the Penguins' season ended, each player received a $5,000 league bonus for reaching the semifinals. With it, he bought a new sports car, a burnt orange Mercury Cougar. For Michel Briere, the summer ahead seemed mapped out. He was set to marry his high school sweetheart in 5 weeks. Their son, Martin, had just turned 1, but the wedding never came. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Briere took his new car out along Route 117 near his home in northern Quebec. He entered a bend too fast, a turn that now bears his name, and the car rolled. He was thrown clear of the vehicle, unconscious at the scene, and never fully recovered. The damage to his brain was severe. News reached Pittsburgh quickly. The first reports were grim, but they carried one crucial detail. He was alive. And where there was life, there was hope. In Quebec, amid a series of emergency operations, Briere could open his eyes, swallow food, and at least once squeeze a hand, but he could not communicate. Small positive signs carried great weight back in Pittsburgh. Fans followed daily updates. The organization set his number 21 aside for the season, waiting to restore it when he returned. Red Kelly believed he might be back by Christmas. But days turned into weeks, and the small improvements stopped. Weeks turned into months. Briere's weight fell to a frail 110 pounds. Doctors cautioned that even if he woke, he would likely never walk again. Some feared he would never breathe without assistance. In Pittsburgh, the updates grew shorter, then less frequent, then silent. He never woke up. On April 13, 1971, 1 year to the day of his overtime winner in Oakland, Michel Briere died. He was 21 years old. For the Penguins, the loss went beyond a promising young center. In one offseason, they lost the only real sense of direction the franchise had ever felt. The optimism of that spring, the crowds, the late-season push, the feeling that something was finally forming, evaporated. The team slipped back towards thin crowds, anonymous rosters, and the old suspicion that whatever they were building in 1970 had been cut off mid-sentence.